USPAP, page 166, Advisory Opinion 35, AO-35. This communication by the Appraisal Standards Board, ASB, does not establish new standards or interpret existing standards. Advisory opinions are issued to illustrate the applicability of appraisal standards in specific situations and to offer advice from the ASB for the resolution of appraisal issues and problems. Subject: reasonable exposure time in real property and personal property opinions of value. Application: real property, personal property. The issue: the concept of exposure time has an important role in the appraisal process. When reasonable exposure time is a component of the definition of value, appraisers must develop an opinion of the reasonable exposure time linked to the value opinion. Background: reasonable exposure time is one of a series of conditions. In most market value definitions, exposure time is always presumed to precede the effective date of the appraisal. The definitions in USPAP include the following: exposure time: estimated length of time that the property interest being appraised would have been offered on the market prior to the hypothetical consummation of a sale at market value on the effective date of the appraisal. Comment: exposure time is a retrospective opinion based on an analysis of past events, assuming a competitive and open market. The comments to Standards Rule 1-2C and 7-2C state: when reasonable exposure time is a component of the definition for the value opinion being developed, the appraiser must also develop an opinion of reasonable exposure time linked to that value opinion. The comments to Standards Rule 2-2A5 and 2-2B5 state: when an opinion of reasonable exposure time has been developed in compliance with Standards Rule 1-2C, the opinion must be stated in the report. Similar comments appear in Standards Rule 8-2A5 and 8-2B5. How is the opinion of reasonable exposure time developed? Is it presumed that to occur prior to or starting from the effective date of the appraisal? Advice from the ASB on this issue: exposure time is different for various types of property and under various market conditions. It is noted that the overall concept of reasonable exposure encompasses not only adequate, sufficient, and reasonable time, but also adequate, sufficient, and reasonable effort. The fact that exposure time is always presumed to occur prior to the effective date of the appraisal is substantiated by related facts in the appraisal process. Supply/demand conditions as of the effective date of the appraisal, the use of current cost information, The analysis of historical sales information, which means sold after exposure and after completion of negotiations between the seller and buyer, and the analysis of future income expectancy projected from the effective date of the appraisal. The importance of exposure time. The answer to the question, what is reasonable exposure time, should always incorporate the answers to the question, for what kind of property at what value range, rather than appear as a statement of an isolated time period. Take, for example, an appraisal of a desirable mountainside second home. In this immediate resort neighborhood, these homes often sell for upwards of $1 million and average 120 to 180 days to sell. Research reveals that overall, page 167, the community generally has an average exposure time of 60 to 90 days, and that home values are typically below $300,000. The appraiser must be certain that research is based upon locations, price ranges, and overall appeal similar to the subject property. Failure to do so may impact the appraiser's ability to deliver credible results. An analysis of exposure time also impacts comparable selection. If a particular property sold faster than one would expect, the appraiser must investigate whether this property was underpriced or if the buyer or seller were highly motivated. The opposite is true. When it took much longer than market evidence would suggest, apparent inconsistencies such as these may also provide vital insight into changes in the market, neighborhood, and the subject property's appeal within the market in general. These sales may not reflect the conditions requisite to the requirement of the definition of market value. Failure of the appraiser to investigate these circumstances may impact the appraiser's ability to deliver credible results. It is possible these sales can still be used when the application of appropriate adjustments. Nonetheless, this determination cannot be made without market research. Rationale and method for developing an opinion of reasonable exposure time. The opinion of the time period for reasonable exposure is not intended to be a prediction of a date of sale. Instead, it is an integral part of the analysis conducted during the appraisal assignment. Sources that may be relied upon include one or more of the following: statistical information about days on market, information gathered through sales verification, interviews of market participants, and information from data collection services. Related information garnered through this process may include the identification of typical buyers and sellers for the type of property involved and typical equity investment levels and/or financing terms. The opinion of reasonable exposure time may be expressed as a range. For instance, the appraiser's opinion of reasonable exposure time for the subject property is 90 to 120 days, or a specific number. For instance, the appraiser's opinion of reasonable exposure time for the subject property is 6 months. The reasonable exposure period is a function of price, time, and use, not an isolated opinion of time alone. As an example, an office building, an important artwork, a fine gemstone, a process facility, or an aircraft could have been on the market for 2 years at a price of $2 million, which informed market participants considered unreasonable. Then the owner lowered the price to $1.6 million and started to receive offers, culminating in a transaction at $1.4 million. 6 months later, although the actual exposure time was 2.5 years, the reasonable exposure time at a value range of 1.4 million to 1.6 million would be 6 months. The answer to the question, what is reasonable exposure time, should always incorporate the answers to the question. For what kind of property at what value range, rather than appear as a statement of an isolated time period. Applications to client uses of an appraisal. When an appraisal is commissioned as the result of a mortgage application after a potential seller and buyer enter into a contract for sale, no conflict exists between the presumption in the appraisal process that exposure time occurs prior to the effective date of the appraisal and the intended use of the appraisal. Appraisers need to be aware that clients and other intended users often confuse exposure time with marketing time. A key difference is that exposure time is assumed to occur before the effective date, and marketing time occurs after the effective date. The misconception is easily understood because most sources of market information report historical information about days on market as marketing time. When the value opinion developed is not predicted on reasonable exposure time, the appraiser's opinion of reasonable exposure time is not required. For example, many appraisals commissioned for employee relocation, asset evaluation, foreclosure, or asset management purposes require a value based on a client-imposed limited marketing period. In these cases, the resulting opinion of value is usually not market value. Problems may arise when clients attempt to make business decisions or account for assets without understanding the differences between reasonable exposure time and marketing time. See Related Advisory Opinion 7, Marketing Time Opinions.